Jason Reynolds, take one, marker.
My name is Jason Reynolds, and I am an author.
I actually want to start in the beginning. I'm curious about where you grew up in Oxon Hill. Growing up in the 80s, especially in a black neighborhood.
When you're growing up, you're growing up. And when you've grown up, you have perspective. And you sort of look back. Oxon Hill now, the way I feel about it has changed because I'm probably more grateful for Oxon Hill today than I think I was then. I think then you're just in it, right? And Oxon Hill is one of these neighborhoods, specifically my part of Oxon Hill, is one of these communities where we had a little bit of everything. You knew that like I lived next door to a teacher, and on the other side there was a preacher, right? But you also had a hustler who lived up the street. You had, around the corner there was all these other things going on. And you knew that like in this sort of hodgepodge community, there was a little bit of everything, and whatever you were looking for, you could find. Right? It's like if you were looking for the good was around you. Mentorship was around you. Examples were around you. And if you were looking for that which was a bit more funky, all that was around you too, right? And there were lots of mentors and examples of that as well. And I think looking at it now, right, and in retrospect, I think it made me malleable. It made me adaptable. It made me fearless, and that I could move through the world, any part of the world, and sort of feel comfortable, right? Nowhere is strange to me just because a little bit of everything was right there in my neighborhood. I also live, just 2 blocks from the DC line, right? They used to call Oxon Hill Ward 9, right? Like this sort of, this weird community just outside of the south side of the city. And we could walk. DC and Maryland aren't separated by water. You just walk across the street. Right? It's not like Jersey and New York. It's not like, right, you just walk across the street and then you're in the city, right? And so we spent a lot of time, me and my friends, just going down the street and hanging out on the south side of Washington, D.C., catching the bus and moving all over. The bus stop was in front of my house. So like you just move all over the place and go to the train station and do all the things that any kid in those environments can do, go on adventures and make your mistakes and do all those things. Everything was right there in this weird little community, of Oxon Hill.
What was the demographic
Black.
culturally?
Black. Yeah. It was a black neighborhood. I mean, there were remnants of old Oxon Hill sort of lingering. So we had Mr. Ron. Mr. Ron lived up the block, old white man, rode a bicycle everywhere. The coolest dude in the world though, right? Never felt uncomfortable. It was sort of like everybody knew Mr. Ron. Mr. Ron knew everybody. And Mr. Ron rode a bike until he was probably 100 years old. You see him just riding around and taking care of his business. A wonderful person. And then there was another white guy who lived next to him that didn't speak to anyone, right? And he, if the ball bounced in his yard, we were in trouble, right? And then there were 2 older white ladies who didn't live on my block, who lived in a different part of Oxon Hill, but they would just walk around. You would see them everywhere, just walking, like walking buddies, and you see them occasionally stop and like pick up trash and nobody bothered them. I never knew their names. I never knew where they lived or who they were or how long they'd been around there. But they were mainstays and nobody bothered them. Nobody, it's sort of like they felt safe. We were okay with them sort of being around. Nobody messed with them. And that's pretty much it. Like I don't know if there were any more white folks or any other nationality or ethnicity in my community, by the way. Not just white people, but there was no one else there but black people in Oxon Hill when I was growing up.
I wonder, I grew up in East Flatbush, and there were certain smells and sounds and daily goings on in the neighborhood that was very familiar. And also, I feel like growing up in the 80s, especially in most neighborhoods, especially in black neighborhoods, we were out in the street all day long.
Yeah, outside.
So what were some of those sounds and smells?
Yeah, outside babies first and foremost, right? We were outside. You open the door. My mom opened the door at 9 o'clock in the morning. And that's it. Like, go outside, and it's like, and do what? Don't matter. But, and without cell phones, without any of the things that we have now to monitor the whereabouts of children, we were just outside on our own and expected to just be home before it was dark, right? Street light rules, right? But mom has no idea what we're doing or where we are, and it apparently didn't really matter that much to her. And that time, it wasn't like it is now. First of all, we start within the house, right? So I come from a very traditional black, well, I wouldn't say traditional actually, but I come from this black household where my mom is a Southern woman. So on Sunday mornings you had gospel music playing. On Saturday mornings, it's the same thing as it is with so many of us. You play Anita Baker, you play, right, because we got to clean the house, right? On Friday nights, my mom played funk music on the radio. And that's just what it was, right? My father was it was different. So when we got in his car, it was all like rock and roll, right? We were listening to Hendrix, and we were listening to Bruce, and we were listening to, just all sorts of, he loved 80s pop rock, right? So we listened to Hall & Oates and all of that kind of stuff. And it was Phil Collins, right? And that was sort of another sound that we heard. We also heard my father and my next door neighbors, 2 houses down, Sadani and Hassan, some of my father's friends' sons, basically. They were all like gearheads, right? So they're all outside fixing cars. My father was a big mechanic kind of guy, right? So they're fixing cars, and you're hearing the sounds of the ratchet clicking. You're hearing them trying to start a car that won't turn over. You're hearing beer bottles. You're hearing lots of cussing and, just noise. And on the other side, the preacher, it was very different, right? Because there wasn't any of that. It was more sort of like the gospel music of him going to church on Sundays and packing up all of his children to get there and things of that nature. And then up the street, at the top of the block, you had Mr. Rufus, my favorite person, because Mr. Rufus lived at the very top of the block, and he is still alive. He's the wildest man I've ever known. When I was a kid, he's like, look, I'm gonna teach you how to weed whack. Right, and as my mom, of course, is like, my son this is a little kid. He like, nah, it's all good. Come up here, and he would take tobacco juice because he used to chew tobacco, and he would spit in this jar, and he would take the jar of tobacco juice. I don't know what you call that, right? But it looked like oil, and he would pour it into the weed whacker. I have no idea why or what this does or if it's even good for the weed whacker, but that's the way he used to crank up the weed whacker. And the first time I saw that, it was, of course, the strangest experience, but also the coolest thing in the world to then use this machine to chop down whatever was in his yard. He also was a car man, so he had cars all over the place. Still to this day, when you come to my mother's block, there's cars everywhere in the way, right? As he's out there trying to fix everybody's car. And then he also threw the most ridiculous barbecues, and everybody would be out there. His family, everybody, was just outside doing that. Across the street from him was the candy lady and everybody's babysitter, Miss Cece. And Miss Cece wasn't a whole lot of noise unless she was yelling at her kids, and she did that often. But she loved us, and we all loved her. And I'll tell you, her house looked very different. Her yard, because she was a person who took care of a lot of kids and therefore bought a lot of stuff, games and food, and so there was stuff everywhere outside of her house and inside, right? It's like walking through, a child's paradise just when you get to. But if you're a homeowner, you're like, clean up, yeah, you know what I mean? But it just was what it was, and she got to kind of do what she wanted to do because she was the person looking out for everybody's kids, you know what I mean? And that was sort of an agreement that we all had, And you had to deal with ambulances. People on my block were also, I've had my neighbors die of AIDS during this time. This is the 80s and the early 90s, right? People are dying of AIDS, and that's happening. And so we're seeing ambulances. We're seeing, you're dealing with all of that stuff too. You're dealing with cop cars because of break-ins and things of that nature as well. Dogs barking. Everybody, in the 80s, everybody had a dog, and most people had outside dogs. This is a very different time now, right? Back then, your dog was on the outside. Your dog was in a doghouse, right? And your dog, if you lived in those kinds of neighborhoods, it was like your dog ain't coming inside. And so a lot of dog barking all night, all the time, right? Just because people had outside dogs. Mr. Brooks had a chow we all thought looked like a lion, and we were terrified of him. Mr. Ty lived next to him, and he had an Akita that we thought was a wolf, and we were terrified of it. These are things that sort of made me who I am. Me and my siblings and my friends, right? All of us kind of grew up in this community. Oh, you hear telephone cords, long telephone cords, the straight ones from back in the day. We would use those to double dutch, right? To jump rope. And so you'd hear the skipping of the ropes, right? You'd hear the sound of roller skates, the wheels of roller skates on the asphalt, right? We would go to the roller rink, but Miss Cece had tons of skates for us to just put on, and we could just skate up and down the street. Right, all of those things are the sounds of the soundscape of my childhood. Yeah. Ice cream trucks, of course.
It's interesting because you also didn't necessarily go away. I mean, you lived in New York for 16 years, but because of your relationship with your mom, you go back often. But what's it like to go back to the old block nowadays?
It's different. The block has all changed. The block was very young when I was growing up. Everybody was young, and everyone had young kids, and so it felt like at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. There was a watershed and all the kids just poured into the street, onto the block, and we just hung out all day, or we just migrated to this part of the neighborhood, or to another neighborhood, right? But now everyone's kids are gone and no one came back. And all of these old ladies and old men have kept their houses for the most part, on my mom's block, for the most part. I think 1 or 2 people are gone, but same neighbors, everyone's just kind of chilling, and they're now aged, right? They're now elders, and so it's quiet. It's a quiet block. Up the street, most of my neighborhood has also turned over. I mean, everybody got to find a place to live, and Oxon Hill is still a place that you can afford, right? Oxon Hill is never going to be gentrified. Oxon Hill is still what Oxon Hill was, right? It's just a different demographic of people now, right? A lot of black folk have moved on, or have passed away, or have lost their houses for that matter, and a lot of my Latino brothers and sisters are now there, which is absolutely fine. I think, just keeping in mind that, like, well, we all need habitat. We all need places to be. First generation folks need places to be, right? Newcomers to the country need places to be as they build their lives here. And so for me, when I ride down the street, it actually kind of warms me to see people doing the same thing that my mother did when she bought that house in 1981 or 80, whatever it was. The first person in our family to own a home, right? She moved across the line. She lived not too far in DC. She moved across the line and she bought a house as the first person to own a home, moved all of her family in until they were able to afford to buy their own. And to see the same thing happening for other families who are just trying to make a way is actually, for me, is actually kind of cool.
Describe what street life was like in Oxon Hill. What was home life like?
My home life was, honestly, it was so cool. This is another thing that sort of comes into clearer view as you get older, as I've gotten older. I realize now that I was growing up in a household with an uncanny amount of freedom. That my parents were together for the first 10 years. And they modeled love in a really specific and vibrant way. My father was very affectionate. They were a touchy-feely couple, which as a kid, it's so gross. As an adult though, like, I know what love looks like. I know what it's supposed to feel like. And even when my parents broke up and divorced, they still were good friends. And so I also got to see what love looks like when the circumstance changes, right? They still loved each other, but just the conditions were different, right? And I got to see what that looked like as well in that house. The other thing was my mom was all about open channels of communication. So she had rough days, right? There were some days that were sticky for us, of course, because she's a person, she's a human, and she was carrying a lot of weight trying to make sure that everything stayed afloat, that me, my older brother, that everybody was safe, that the streets hadn't done what it does to so many black boys, but also that we were testing our boundaries, that we were pushing the line a little bit. She understood that was a part of our maturation and made space for it. She made space for us to say anything we wanted to say. I never had to worry about hiding and lying. I never had to I could just say hey, I'm interested in these things, or I want to do this, or I want to try this, or what does this mean, or I'm afraid of these things, or I like this girl. I remember this one time, and this will give you a good glimpse of who she was. I remember being in the 10th grade or 11th grade, and I had this girlfriend. We really were just dating. We weren't but we were dating, and I liked her a lot. And it was Valentine's Day, and I was like, Mom, I need to do this right. I need to impress this girl, right? It's snowing. I never forget, it was snow on the ground. And my mom was like, cool, I'm gonna tell you what to do, right? She was like, you go to the store. We're gonna go get you a Stouffer's lasagna. Right? I'll never forget this, because I was like, Mom, you gotta help me, I gotta make a nice dinner, you know what I mean? So you're gonna go to the store, get you some Stouffer's lasagna. We're gonna cook the lasagna. Then we're gonna take it out the tin, and we're gonna put it in a pan, as if you made this, right? And then you're gonna pull it out the oven when she get here, and you're gonna cut it, and you're gonna serve it, right? And then on top of all of this, my mom was like, and I'm gonna leave the house. I'm gonna give you this space for your romantic time. I'm gonna allow for you to learn how to do this, because you're gonna need to know how to do this, right? How to treat someone that you care for, and how to be I think romantic is a cheap word. I think it diminishes what she was trying to teach me was how to be thoughtful, how to be intentional, and how to put forth effort even when you may lack resource or talent, right? It was like, you might not know how to cook lasagna, but we finna work around that, and it's gonna be good, it's gonna taste good, and she might know the difference, she might not, but she'll appreciate the effort. And it was an amazing night, right? And that's who she was. It was always like, how do I give my kids the edge? How do I teach them how to move through the world, how to see the world and view it, right? How do I teach them sort of how to change bits of it that they want to change? How do I give them a heightened sense of discernment while also giving them the wings to be unafraid?
Yeah. Did you have brothers and sisters that you grew up with in the house?
So I have an older brother and an older sister. I have a little brother as well. But the older brother is who I primarily grew up with in the house. And that was a trip. He had 8 years on me. And that's a lot of time to build resentment. And we're very close now. But my brother was one of these guys who, he was dealt a tough hand, and he did the best he could. My mom and my father did the best they could. Everybody did the best they could to sort of make sure that he got what he needed. But this is a different time. My brother had learning differences at a time when we weren't sure, we didn't know how to diagnose them. We weren't sure how to sort of care for these people, for these young people. We weren't sure how to sort of delineate and disseminate resources for these young folks, right? Back then, you just put the short bus, or you put them in a resource room, or it was almost like they were in a leper colony. Right, when really it was like, nah, I just learned differently. Like, I don't have a disease, right? I just learned differently. But this is 80s, right? This is the 80s and the early 90s, and my brother, he took some licks, and then he started to deliver a few licks, and that complicated life even more. I'll tell you this one story, man. My brother he couldn't stand me, but it wasn't some sort of deep-seated hate. It was that he was 16 and I was 8, right? It was like, and my mother was very much like, hey, you going outside? Take your little brother, right? Where you going? Take your little brother, right? Because she needed a break. And it was like, look. And also it's like, yo, that's your little brother. You need to look out like that's your brother. This is your blood, you know? But my brother was like, I'm with my friend. I'm doing things that he don't need to see, right? And when he was 17, he was in a terrible accident and was stabbed in the face. And he loses an eye. I'll never forget this. He loses an eye. We are out of town. My brother did not come out of town with us. My mother and father are out of town. We rush back. We go to the hospital. He's in the hospital with the bandage on. It's a gory scene, right? And he's sleeping, and I'm worried because no matter how he treated me, he was always my hero. Nothing he could have done could have shaken the way I felt about him as an older brother. And I remember he woke up and he's sort of starting to rehab, and everything was different. Right, it's like a weird, and he and I've talked about this. It's in the taking of the partial taking of his sight. He was able to see something else and see something clearly, and one of the things that he was able to see was just how much I loved him, and how much, like I'm your person, bro. Like I don't care what you do to me. When you woke up, I was at the hospital. I was next to your bed. Your little brother, 8, 9 years old, concerned, right? It's me who's here. It's me who's always been here, right? When me and my mother would go to dinner without him, or we take a ride to the store and she's mad at something he done, it was me defending you. It was me saying, don't talk about him like that. It's me saying you should get off his back, right? Being sort of, chippy with our mother on your behalf without you even knowing. When we go to restaurants, because he was a shy guy, I will order your food for you. Right, as your little brother, I always protected you, right? And I think and we both know that now, right? But we woke up and our lives were never the same. Our relationship was completely different from there on out, So I say all that to say, it was interesting growing up with my older brother. It wasn't the traditional big brother, little brother story. I think it had a lot of peaks and valleys, and I honestly think it's one of the most beautiful parts of our lives,
Throughout your life, you've had the opportunity to observe. You talked about the sounds and smells of your neighborhood, just the way your home life went, and just watching your brother, but still being there as a constant source. What do you feel that you were able to gain being that middle child, being 8 years younger, and being able to observe, even the way you talked about your relationship with your parents,
Yeah, I think, I think my observations have given me an incredible sense of grounding, You know, I tell my brother this all the time. Growing up with him, I could never be unkind. I could never call anybody stupid or ugly, or like it's hard for me, right? Like I because I know how he was treated, and I watched and was there to sort of see how he was treated. I also, like I was saying about my parents, right? Observing them, I know that that love is not ownership, that it isn't, that it can't even be encapsulated by titles and contracts, and you know, like I don't believe in any of that. I mean, I think that it's bigger than all of it. I think that love is bigger than a marriage. It's bigger than you know, than a household, right? It's bigger than all those things. And I got to watch my parents sort of enact that. And it wasn't perfect, right? It took time to heal, but even in the midst of the healing process, they were loving toward one another. I mean, it's a weird thing to say sometimes to people, but I really believe that like if you love me, then don't treat me like you hate. It's simple. Don't treat me like you hate me. And if you leave me, then leave me like you love me. Leave me like you love me, right? Like not like I'm your enemy, right? And I think because life is life, and I think we try to create these weird sort of fantasies and fairy tales around how life is apparently an unchanging thing. Everything in life changes, but apparently our love, right? Or apparently our situation where the love is encapsulated, right? In this particular case, marriage. The truth is, I wish life were that simple. But everything in life changes. And it doesn't mean that marriages don't last. It just means that if they don't last, you can still leave me. We can leave each other like we love each other, because we do love each other. And I think that was something that I observed. I think I observed my mother with her siblings. I watched them fight, and then I watched them let it go. Like they were so mean. They could be so mean to each other, three sisters. They could really get at it, right? And then like 5 minutes later, it's like, all right, like, you know, we got that out. We said what we said. Nobody takes anything personal. And I think I learned that, yo, I'm a person. Things can get a little dicey, right? But it doesn't mean I don't love you. It means that I need to express myself to you. Maybe you hurt my feelings, or maybe you've done something that I think is wrong, and I'm gonna tell you that. But after I tell you that, like, let's move forward. And I watched them do this for over and over. And I mean, I watched my mother do this with her older sister still, right? I think I got to watch my mom work, and it taught me what to do and what not to do, right? It taught me that that there is value in work ethic. There is not value in working yourself to death.
What'd your mom do?
My mom worked in insurance, and then she was an educator. But she worked in insurance from the ages of 15 to 50, and then she worked in education from 55 to 75. Right? This is a person who only knows work. It's all she knows is to work. And so I know how to work. I know how to not make excuses for the work that needs to be done. I know how to self-motivate. I ain't waiting for no inspiration. I ain't waiting for nobody to tell me I gotta do something. Every day I wake up and I get to it. I have a ritual, I have routines, I get to it. At the same time, I watch my mother work herself to the bone, and I watch everybody around her work her to the bone, because they knew that she was a worker bee, right? And we've been having conversations recently about me sort of slowing down or taking a break, or, you know, buying a house on the beach or somewhere else where I can sit and relax. And she's like, well, what are you gonna do? I'm like, I'm gonna sit down. Like, I'm gonna sit down. I'm gonna take some deep breaths. I'm gonna look at the water, read a little bit, learn something new. And she's like, but you couldn't just let all of this, you couldn't just quit, right? And I was like, maybe. And she's like, but like, what about your purpose in life? I'm like, it might have been fulfilled, right? Or perhaps there are multiple purposes. And I know what my purpose is not, which is to work myself to death. I just don't agree with that. I think this new generation is like, yeah, nah, I don't think, because what I know for sure is that I'm just one in the number, right? Like when my time is up, people will mourn for me for a day or a week, and then everybody will move forward. The world will keep turning, and there'll be somebody else to do the work. And that's a reality. It sounds a bit macabre, but it's true. Toni Morrison, the great Toni Morrison, died, and we mourned. We mourned for a week. We mourned for 2 weeks, and the world kept moving. We reference her work when we can, but the world just kept going. There's no holiday. The world just keeps going, and I I want to make sure that when my time comes, that I can also say that I enjoyed myself, that I rested, that I kicked back and got to see the world around me as a beautiful place, not just trying to figure out how to translate the beauty into something that I'm making for work. And you know, I don't want to live like as my mentor Walter D. Myers said. I don't want to live my dream and never live my life. There's no merit to them. Old black folk, they put a lot of value in this, like, now you gotta work yourself. I'm like, I'm about to drop dead on no job. I don't think we have to do that, right? Or at least those of us who don't, right? And if I'm privileged enough to be in a position where I don't, then I won't. But it's still something that I observed watching my mother do and realizing, like, I love you, but that's a part of that chain I'm gonna break.
Tell me about your grandmother.
My grandma, on my mom's side, Daisy Bell Former. Daisy Bell was a wild, you know, back in those days they had all kind of strange pejoratives like battle axe and all, you know what I mean? And she would have counted as one of those women. She ain't take no mess. She'd put a gun to your face in a heartbeat if you threatened her children, especially coming up in South Carolina. So if you were a white man threatening her family, then you were going to be looking down the barrel of a double, you know, of a shotgun, right? Like, and that was just the realities for her. She worked the fields and managed a farm, right? My grandfather had land. So my mom's story is very different because they had hundreds of acres of land. And because they had hundreds of acres of land, that would have made them wealthy in South Carolina. They had more money than most people because they had more land. And land equals money and power. And this would have been the 1940s, right? In the 40s, you know, my grandfather had workers. He's like, look, you don't want to be a sharecropper? I'll pay you a wage. I'll actually pay you. You can be an employee, right? Which is very different than being a sharecropper, right? And so he would make sure that he had farmers, he had people to work his land. My mother would get out there, her sisters would work the land as well. My grandmother would cook everybody lunch, make sure that everybody was taken care of, make sure their babies were taken care of, make sure everybody got to and from work to home. And then after they all left, would then get in the field herself to scrap cotton, right? Like this is a woman who, and then later on, you know, moving to DC in 55, would go up to Silver Spring and Montgomery County and clean white folks' houses. Just like a woman who had a sturdier backbone than most. You know, I think Maya Angelou talks about that, right? The steel rod, right, through the back of this woman, someone who was unwavering. And you know, I look back on this now because I think we romanticize the stories of persistence. The truth is, my grandmother deserved to be soft, right? I see it all differently now. I'm like, am I proud of what I'm made of? Yeah, right? Because I'm made of oak, I'm made of pine, right? I come from thick, sturdy wood. You know, I come from a mud and a dirt that was fertile, but still had to be worked, right? I come from that. That matters to me, right? I know what that means in terms of my identity. But I also come from a people who were never allowed to be soft. My mother was never allowed to be soft. My mother says that she learned to hug from when I was born, right? She learned to hug. She learned affection through me, right? Beginning with my father, because he was like, I need you to, right? Like, but that wasn't a natural instinct for her because of the way she was raised by her mother and father. Affection wasn't a thing that they offered much. Love, they knew very well, but softness, the gentleness of touch, right? The laying of a head on a bosom, and the blanketed feeling that gives is immeasurable. And unfortunately, she didn't get to experience that. My grandmother wasn't that kind of woman because she couldn't be that kind of woman. And so, you know, I look at these ladies and I'm proud. And I got a bit of a chip on my shoulder because of them, and I feel 10 feet tall because of them. But I also know that they deserved more than strength. And that for my life, I will not be anything other than a whole person, one that can access my emotions, my feelings, and can give of myself in spaces that are vulnerable without fear.
Especially with Black people, I mean, it's beautiful to be able to, especially in your shoes, within your generation, look back and see those character traits. I mean, there are scientific studies that show that those character traits pass down from generation to generation to generation, sometimes 7 generations down. And so you can be both things. You can still inhabit the strength that your mother, your mother's mother, you know, you can go back however many generations, you know, you can still inhabit that strength, but you can still realize that there's also something greater and something better possible.
Yeah, you know, my father was a bit of a softer man, you know, and I never saw him that way until later in life. But you know, same thing. Look back on it, it's like my father was the one who was kissing his boys. My father got us up in the morning. He cooked us breakfast. He took us. My father did all those things. My mother was at work at 5 o'clock in the morning, right? My father was the one who was. He was just a. Yeah, I mean, he was loving in a different way. He had a gentle touch. My father never touched us. He wasn't going. My mom did, right? My mom, my mom would, you know, she put the boots to you, but my dad never. He could never, You know, he was just a big old teddy bear. He looked menacing, covered in tattoos, motorcycle gold chains, and all of this stuff, right? But he really was just a sweetheart with a whole lot of charisma and a whole lot of sensitivity to for anyone who needed it, you know.
One of the reasons you can, and you mentioned this just now, that you can stand 10 toes deep nowadays is because you sit on the shoulders of Isabel Reynolds. Tell me about your moms.
You know, Isabel Reynolds is, to me, for a woman coming up in her time, a revolutionary, a maverick. She says this about her mother, but when I look at my mom, I look at her, I'm like, yo, you really did some special things. You know, this is a woman, 15 years, she graduates from high school early. First of all, she's from the mud, right? From rural South Carolina. They moved to DC when she's 10 years old, and the DC school system does everything they can to keep her back because of an accent, right? They looked at her accent as if it was a symbol for ignorance, as if she could not know, she could not keep up with the rigor of a city education. My mom was being taught in one-room schoolhouses, and like, you know, my mom was going to school with her older sister because they had to go somewhere. So your big sister going to school, it ain't time for you to go to school, but go with her because you got to go. We're gonna be in the field. Somebody got to watch after you, so go with your older sister, right? And so she was able to be in school earlier than usual, gets to DC, gets challenged, and her mother is like, let her test. Let her test. And then ends up graduating early, right? Like, which is also to say, don't sleep on, I think sometimes we sleep on the South, the brilliance of the South. There's a lot of brilliance in that red clay, right? Accents are accents. They have nothing to do with our intellectual capacities, right?
Yeah, there's ingenuity, there's, you know.
Come on, man, there's resourcefulness. A New Yorker can tell me the fanciest place to eat, and a South Carolinian can tell me how to grow that. It's very different, right? And so she gets to DC, she graduates early, she takes a job, 15, 16 years old, working in the mailroom of this insurance policy place. And works her way up, you know, goes to the March on Washington and realizes that, like, oh, she's 16, goes to the March on Washington and realizes, oh, this moment, being here, has catalyzed me, and I now know I will not stay in the mailroom. Before that, she wasn't sure. Women didn't have a lot of opportunity. Black women had even less, right? Either you're gonna be a secretary, a teacher, or you're gonna work in the mailroom. And my mama's like, after witnessing what I've just witnessed, I don't know where I'm going, but I know I'm not gonna stay in this mailroom. Took her 12 years to get a bachelor's degree, got a bachelor's degree in education while working every single day and going to school one class at a time and doing it the hard way. The first person in our family to get a degree, even after taking 12 years to do so, right? She ends up working her way up the ladder, learns all these interesting things along the way. You know, I was raised in a household where, like, we were taught how to use a soup spoon and a salad fork, right? Because my mom was taught this by the people around her who were trying. There was one particular white man named Harry who basically was like, I can see it in you. Let me give you some of this game, right? Because you're gonna have to know how to speak this language and move this way, and right? And so let me show you how to order a drink. Let me show you, you know, how to order, what to order at a restaurant. That's a, you know, that may be a business meeting, right? Let me show you sort of which spoons do what forks do. My mother didn't know. How would she have known, right? How to go from the outside in, or which water is yours, right? All of these things. And my mother learned all that and brought all that home, right? Made sure that we got all that game, how to comport ourselves in whatever environment, without telling us that who we were naturally. Like, it was never like you had to be somebody different. It was like, look, man, different places got different rules, but you get to be you all the time. Just know that this fork is for the salad. Now, if for some reason you're throwing a party and you invite somebody over who may not know these rules and they pick up the wrong fork, but then you pick up the wrong fork too, right? That is now the salad fork, right? We learn that. We learn sort of how to adjust and adapt and how to, like I said, how to move. And she got that from, the people on her job who saw potential and helped her move all the way up to the supervisor position, right? As the first Black person and the first Black woman to hold that position, right? Nobody, and now while doing all of this, as a super professional woman, she would then come home and like have a whole separate part of herself, right? It's like, all right, now in the house, it's gonna be meditation, it's gonna be, poem reading, it's gonna be, right, we got crystals, we got, I always laugh because these days, all of this is so en vogue, right? Everybody's got like, every woman I know is like, oh yeah, I got my crystals, it's gonna be a full moon and I gotta do it, right? All this stuff, right? I got my incense, I got my Nag Champa, I got my Palo Santo, I got my white sage, right? And this is stuff I grew up in the house with, right? My mom was an herbalist. You open up the cabinets and it's just like all kind of flowers, tree barks and all this stuff because she believed in like naturalism and was like, look, we can make a stew or I can make a tea that's gonna knock that right out, right? We had all these books like Back to Eden and all these sort of like books of the occult that we grew up around and that were very normal and real for us, right? But she also was like, don't tell everybody what you see in this house, right? Because not everybody's gonna understand that, like, down at the bottom of our street, there's a woman down there cooking up stews and she had a little pot. Nowadays we just light the sage and you just walk around with the bundle, right? She bought sage loose. And so you would take a couple of leaves and you put it in a little frying pan, maybe this big, right? And she would light the frying pan up and walk around the house and smoke the house out. And she would smudge the house. Now my friends are sleeping over. And my friends are like, I think your mother's smoking weed, man. And I'm like, we're not smoking weed, man. It's like, this is just a thing we do. Like, this is how she just trying to like, recalibrate the energy in the space. But back then, energy conversations weren't like, it's so weird how now it's also colloquial. But in this time, which is the 80s and the early 90s, my mom was on all of that. She learned all that stuff in the 60s, right? Like she learned all of that very early and had meditation circles and psychics and numerology books and like all this stuff that, that people believe in or don't, right? But it was just, she was interested in all those things. And so our household was full of all of that, right? Trying to get me to meditate, she would leave, when we would leave the house, she would say, take the light with you. Nowadays it's not so. It's everybody's got love and light these days, right? It's everywhere. It's almost like a slogan. It's like T-shirts, right? But like as a kid growing up, a teenager, I'm leaving the house to go party. Hey, you going out? Yeah, I'm out. I'll see you later. Listen, take the light with you, right? It's a thing. And it was. Now I realize just how special that was, how cool it was to live in a house where things were being done differently. How cool it was to be around somebody who really carved their own path when it came to spiritual practices, when it came to parental practices, right? She really was just on her own wave and in her own bag. And I'll always, and still at 78, she's 78 tomorrow, or Wednesday, yeah, she's 78. And still, she's like, I've been thinking about this, that, and the third, or, I got new thoughts on the afterlife, if it's a thing, or I've been thinking about learning this new thing, right? And I am inspired because I know that as I age, I want to be a person who is constantly unfolding myself. And that's what she's done. She's constantly peeled back layer after layer after layer. Every year, every decade, a new layer. And something fresh being exposed underneath that, even as she's entering into the winter of her life.
Yeah, I know it's not all peaches and cream, but it sounds like the environment that you grew up in was like an incubator for free speech, for the, learning unconditional love, and that's the seeds that births empathy and compassion in individuals. Would you say that your mom's is your North Star?
I would say my mom is definitely my North Star. And I would also say, my father, he's another, but he's not too far behind. I think I don't talk about him as much because there was a gap in our relationship, right? But I hit the parental jackpot, like the coolest parents. God bless the dead, he's no longer with us, but he was different, man. They were different. My dad, I grew up with the bad boy father. Like, in the 80s and 90s, so like the bad boy father today looks just like me. The bad boy father in the 80s and 90s, we're talking about a man who was like outside in like tight jeans and a t-shirt, a ripped t-shirt, covered in tattoos, aviator sunglasses on, you know what I mean? Always like a cigar in his mouth or something like that, motorcycles, calendars of women in the garage, and you know, like this, he was a wild guy, right? And was the coolest person in the world, right? Would wake me up in the middle of the night and be like, hey, come on. All right, my older brother asleep, my mama asleep. Come on. We go outside and he start up the motorcycle, Harley Davidson, right? Loudest motorcycle on the planet. And he be like, watch this. He start the motorcycle up, throw me on the back of it. And we would ride around the neighborhood. You would see the lights turning on, everybody waking up upset, right? And he loved it, just to do it, right? Or like it was homecoming one time. He's like, yo, I'm gonna take you. Gave me this amazing, I still have it, Harley Davidson motorcycle jacket, right? Like put this on, put these boots on, right? And then we pulled up on the back of the Harley to homecoming, right? And it's like, yo, he made me cool, right? And so I think I always say my mom is who taught me how to view the world, how to view life, right? She gave me the perspective, right? My father is really, really who taught me, as I got older, who taught me how to move through the world, right? He taught me like charisma. He taught me, I feel like he gave me magnetism in a particular way, because he was one of those guys, right? He walk in the room, temperature changes. He ain't gotta say nothing, right? That kind of like, he had like a thing that I think, hopefully, I think is what I have. My mom doesn't necessarily have that per se. She has a presence, but it's a very different kind of presence. She has the presence where it's like, she must be important, but like, I might not want to talk to her yet. My dad had the presence was like, I don't know who he is, but I definitely need to know, right?
That's dope. Definitely grew up with those. That's my uncle, the way you described it just now, with his 77 Dodge Dart.
Come on, man. I drive a Porsche now because I grew up watching my dad drive Corvettes. Like, that's what we grew, like my dad was always about, like, he was just a fly guy, right? Fly suits, gold watches, gold bracelets, right? Diamond ring, right? He was one of those guys. He looked like a hustler and he moved like a hustler, but he was nothing but a gentleman. He was nothing but a gentleman who just believed that, like, look, I know I'm aware that I'm the coolest person in the room all the time, right? That's my dad, and I think he gave me some of that. And it was like just the perfect amount of ego. Yeah. Just enough, right? No one would have ever called my father arrogant, but everyone knew that it's like, oh, now he knows that he knows who he is.
What was school like for you growing up? You can paint it with a broad stroke, but elementary through college, like, did you excel? Did you struggle?
You know what? I was good until middle school. I skipped second grade. I was starting off. I mean, I was fresh out the gate. I came out the gate like I'm rocking and rolling, right? And that's just because of the way my parents treated me in the household. You know what I mean? We were having whole conversations. You know how this goes. We were having conversations, and I wasn't babied very much. It was just sort of like, hey, you know, these are the things we're expected to do. This is how we talk to you. This is, you know, my neighbors were all, I don't know, I was more like a little man. They sat me at the table with everybody. I didn't have no high chair, right? You want to sit Jason right here with the rest of us. And I would just sit and listen and observe and watch. I had a little rocking chair. My mom would be in the kitchen cooking, and I would sit right at the door in my rocking chair and just observe, right? Like I was sort of always a bit older. And so elementary school seemed like a breeze. I felt like I was too old to be there, right? And second grade, I was basically doing poorly, and the teachers called my parents and was like, look, he's bored to death. He's going to fail unless we move him forward, right? We have to figure this out because this is not enough for him. So they moved me forward to third, which put me 2 years behind everybody because I have a late birthday. And so everything is fine until it's time for middle school. Now when middle school comes, my parents split, so everything happens at the same time. Grandma dies, parents split, all kind of stuff is, you know, I'm starting to write poetry, right? All of this is happening simultaneously. And I'm going to this new school because my mom, none of my dad was gone. My neighborhood school was terrible and it's closed now. My neighborhood middle school was like, my brother went there, it was like a lean on me in that joint, right? and my father was now not in the house. My mom was like, yo, I don't know how we manage. He needs a man here if he's gonna go to this school, right? And so we're gonna figure out something else. And so she sends me to Catholic school. Man, culture shock, man. I gotta wear a uniform. I was away from my friends. I was away from my neighborhood. It was terrible, right? I'm 10 years old. I'm 2 years younger than everybody else. So I'm tiny. And I immediately started to do poorly. Yeah, my first D's are coming in, D in science, D in this, right? Like I'm upset about my parents' situation, and then after that I began to be manipulative because I knew I could. It's a good excuse, right? It's like my parents are breaking up, right? Meanwhile, I'm just like not doing anything.
And it's not because you couldn't do the work.
Nah, I could do the work. I could do the work. I could do the work. It was difficult for me though. I think that gap between 10 and 12, my emotional maturity wasn't there, right? And so like I was hitting a ceiling for sure. But I could have done more of the work, I'll say that. And then high school was pretty much the same. High school, I was 12, man. I was 12 in the 9th grade. I was a little kid. And I did the best I could. There were some moments where I excelled, but for the most part, it was a slog, man. And also, I just wasn't interested. I wasn't as interested. I was interested in all the extracurriculars. Every club I was in, I played sports. I did all the things, and I loved all of that stuff. But I wouldn't call myself the most studious kid. I wasn't a complete sort of, I wasn't just trying to duff it all, right? But I just was kind of like, man, I just need to do enough to get by. All of my report cards say the same thing, right? It's not living up to one's potential, right? It's that kind of thing, which I have for me, it's like, yeah, that's true, but also I'm not sure my teachers were living up to their potential either. And the ones that were, I performed for.
Tell me about some of those that pushed you.
Miss Blaufus, whom I love and still talk to this day. Miss Blaufus was my 10th grade English teacher. Couldn't stand her. She was probably 25 years old. I couldn't stand it. She was coming from Yale or something like that, right? And it was kind of like, when you're a kid, you're just like, if you're hard on me, you hate me. When you're young, right? That's how you feel. When really it's the opposite, right? If you're hard on me, you love me. But when you're young, you're like, yo, this person hates me. She's being mean for no reason. I remember going home being like, you gotta get me out of this class. You gotta figure this out. My mom is like, what are you talking about? It's day one. I'm like, Mom, this person, she hates me. She gonna be mean. She gonna be this. She gonna be that. My mom is like, you gonna have to deal with this, kid. And throughout the year, she was the first teacher to ever notice and acknowledge that I could write, that there was something happening. I wasn't getting good grades per se. I wasn't like knocking it out the park. I would get a C, I would get a D sometimes. But she was the first person to be constructive, to say like, listen, you got it, right? You just work out this or work out that, or pay attention to the instructions, right? Follow directions, right? But so much so that she went to my mom and was like, hey, you need to figure out if he's gonna go to college, try to find a good program, a good writing program. Like he can do something. He's got something. She even started a creative writing class, right? That she was able to sort of pull me into a little small cohort, and I learned sort of all the poetic forms, right? This is a person who really invested in me. The first teacher I would say that really invested in me, and then I also had, I will also say in the 8th grade I had Miss Jones in middle school. I don't know that I feel much about Miss Jones's teaching, but Miss Jones was like a grandmother figure. I know Miss Jones loved me. I know she understood me even in the midst of all of my antics, right? I knew she understood me, and I knew she could see me, which mattered a great deal, right? Mr. Williams, my senior year, he taught a class called Global Studies, and I always say, Mr. Williams taught me how to be a person. He was almost like the glue between my parents. It was like, all right, my father gave me these things, my mother gave me these things. My friends gave me sort of a force field, right, to be safe and creative in myself. But Mr. Williams, at the time in which he came into my life, he gave me just this little bit of like tether. It's like a little bit of glue that kind of makes all of this stuff work, right? And for lots of reasons. Number one, he got to knock down stereotypes. I mean, I grew up in a black neighborhood, man, which means I grew up in a homophobic environment, especially back then. Mr. Williams never came out to us or anything like that, but we all knew that Mr. Williams was a gay man. And we teased him for it until you got in his class. And when you got in his class, he had a way of breaking it all. You couldn't help but love him. You couldn't help but see him, right? You couldn't help but want to know more about who he was. And he was very secretive, right? But to know more about who he was and where he'd been and what he'd experienced. He's seen the world. He traveled all over the world. He had artifacts from every place in the world. I mean, from the deepest bush in Africa to the major cities in Africa, right? To, Mexico and volcanoes and just all over the world, this man had traveled and had documented for us to see. Most of us hadn't left our neighborhoods. And he was showing us like, yo, the world is yours. You have the opportunity, depending upon your work ethic, depending upon your consistency, your ability to manage difficulty, your passions, your imagination, you have the ability to see the world. And he was the first person to show us that. He also taught us about sacrifice. There's a story that I've told a million times about this fish. There was one day we came to class. Mr. Williams says, I have a fish that I bought for you all. It's going to be a class pet, but we're all seniors. So of course we're like, bro, we grown. Like, who cares? And he puts it in this tank, in this aquarium. He says, listen, you can feed the fish every day when you come to class. I need you to name the fish. Now, the only rule is you can't touch the fish, right? Now, if I see you with your hands in the tank for any reasons, and if for any reason your fingers or anything grazes the fish, don't try to lift it up out of the tank. Don't play around with it, right? And if I see you do that, then I'm going to suspend you. That's it, right? You're gonna be in trouble. Cool. Time passes, and we're feeding the fish every day. And one day we come to class, and Mr. Williams takes the fish out of the tank and puts it on the floor. We all gather around. We're confused and mortified as the fish is flopping and flapping and gasping for air. And finally, two young ladies run over. They pick the fish up. They throw the fish back in the tank and save the fish's life. And Mr. Williams says, grab your backpacks and head on down to the principal's office. You're suspended. The rules are the rules, right? Of course, they're upset. We're upset. Everyone's upset. And he's like, I told you that if you touch the fish, you'll be suspended. I told you this was non-negotiable, and you touched the fish. And so, unfortunately, you're suspended. I'm sure your parents will call. It's fine. But you are suspended. You get a 0. I'll see you on Monday. And as they're leaving the classroom, he says, but hold your heads up, because you did the right thing. But sometimes doing the right thing has consequences. I had to then sit down, and for the rest of the class, I had to sort of wallow in my cowardice. And in that moment, I made a decision to save the fish every day. It's a thing I think about once a week, probably. Like, am I willing to go the extra mile? Am I willing to throw my body at a thing, throw my mind at a thing, throw my voice at something that could be that might not be beneficial for me, but for the betterment of our children, for the betterment of our elders, right? For the betterment of somebody who's less fortunate? Or do I have it in me? And every day I check myself to make sure that I do. And that's all because of what I was taught in that class.
Yeah, that's a tremendous lesson. And I think the fruits of what you learn from that lesson is what you strive to pour into your work, to create that response in people when everybody is standing around. Are you going to do the right thing because you know it's the right thing? I'm curious, you mentioned that, the teachers, Mr. Williams, they saw you. We've spoken about this before, but I'm just curious, what's the reason why you didn't connect with the material that you were reading? Is it because you didn't see yourself in the material?
Yeah, because it was boring. I mean, I remember, my senior year, we were reading Chaucer. And look, I'm not here to. I listen. I'm one of these people who I actually don't necessarily think that the classics are bad. I just sometimes think the classics are misplaced. I think that if the classics are truly classic, then they'll be there for us when we're ready for them. And I don't always think that high school students are ready. I think maybe some are, right? But I think the majority, in the world that we live in, I think young people want to feel attached and connected to something. And if they don't feel connected to it, they don't have a lot of time for it, And so I think that, and that's not new. That's been the case since I was a kid. It's been the case since my brother was a kid, right? It's like we're reading Melville and Steinbeck. And by the way, some of those books I really did enjoy at the time, right? I mean, I read the Cliff's Notes, but reading them now, right? I'm like, oh yeah, I can see why this would be entertaining. But I think we just needed an icebreaker. We needed something to set the palette. And I think it's unfair that the way we decide or the way we build palette is by giving young people classics. So the equivalent would be this, right? Let's imagine you're a little kid, you're 2 or 3 years old, or let's say you're 5. Right? We've gotten over the sort of you need nutrients part of your life. You're 5 years old. It's the equivalent of saying all right, 5-year-old, the first thing you're going to have is a medium rare steak. We're gonna give you this fancy French dish this is how you're gonna eat, right? And it's like a kid is like, yo, I really just want some Cheetos. And I think Cheetos are okay. right? I really just want, like, I'm okay with this, but like, Dad, can I get like, candy's delicious, right? Like potato chips are delicious. A juice box is amazing, right? A Lunchable will do the trick. Give me a sandwich, right? I just want a sandwich. Peanut butter and jelly is the greatest thing ever invented, and this could be the thing that we use to begin to build my palate. We don't have to start at 100. We can start with the PB&J so that I can understand, that my palate understands that the savory and the sweet can go together. We can start here, right? And I think for us in school, it's like, yeah, you get to high school and like, now it's time for Chaucer, right? Now it's time for Locke and Pope. It's time for, right? It's time for Keats. It's like, yo, we can read a little Jason Reynolds to get my palate developed, right? We can read a little, right? That's all. I want to build my palate, and we don't have to stay there. But I think that this is a good, especially since right now they've been eating junk food their whole lives. Everyone's been trying to force veggies down their throat. Another example is this. I tell people this all the time, and I'm for the class. I'm for all of it. I love Shakespeare. I just think that we gotta figure out when it's the right time, right? And if we actually have the resources and the time to teach it right, right? And so, like, prime example is Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts, when I was growing up, was the nastiest. This was the one thing you hoped your mother never cooked, right? Anything but this. You can give me anything, right? But just do not give me Brussels sprouts. And then the year 2000 happened. And for some reason in the early aughts, we should track down who this was, by the way. Some genius was like, yo, you know what we could do? We could deep fry or roast these Brussels sprouts, and we can create sauces for Brussels sprouts, right? Now, some might argue that that would mean the Brussels sprout is now less nutritious. And I would say, does it matter if it changed the way we think about Brussels sprouts? And that's the way I think about my work. And I needed the new versions of Brussels sprouts when I was a kid, and they kept giving me the old version of Brussels sprouts. And so I refused to eat.
You got introduced to poetry through music.
That 7th grade year, right, as life is turning upside down, their mom and pop splitting, grandma's dying, and eventually does die. And then I am forced to reckon with the sounds of my mother crying, right? What a strange thing. We talk about sounds, this idea around the soundscape. It's a thing that has stuck with me for 30 years, you know, because it was the first time, and I think that anybody who's ever seen or heard their mother crying, like the first time is a wild experience, because this is your giant, right? You only know them in a particular way. And I needed to figure out a way to make her feel better. I couldn't live, which is a whole other thing. I couldn't live with knowing that she was in pain and that I couldn't do anything about it. So I had discovered, just before this, I had discovered liner notes. My older brother loved music. I loved music. My parents loved music. I grew up in this household where there was a lot of music, but I never owned any of my own. My older brother had everything, but you know, he's an older brother, and so it's not like I can use any of his, right? It's not like he's letting me borrow anything or listen to anything, and so I save up my money and I buy Queen Latifah's Black Rain. This is the album with you and I.T.Y. on it, you know, Weekend Love, classic, iconic, right? And first of all, can we just take one quick moment to say that Queen Latifah that we should be putting much more light on the legacy of Latifah. Honestly, I think that one of the greatest rap stories ever told is the story of Queen Latifah. For another time, but I think that she deserves one of the brightest stars in the constellation of hip hop, and I don't think that we really understand exactly the force that she has been and continues to be. Case in point, what she did for my life, and I read those lyrics and those liner notes, and I realized that this was poetry. I realized that, you know, I'm reciting I too in class, right? I am the darker brother, right? Langston Hughes, and you realize that, like, oh, this is the same thing, right? Looks the same, right? It may sound a little different, but this is the same thing. Perhaps all these rappers are writing poetry. Perhaps if I look at all the words, I can see it differently. And that's how I was introduced to poetry. So then grandma dies, mom is crying, and I do the only thing I know to do at that time, which is to write a few words. Not a rap, just trying to figure out how to write something that makes me feel the way Queen Latifah makes me feel, or the way Tupac makes me feel, or Slick Rick makes me feel, to make my mother feel a little better.
Do you remember the poem?
No, and we can't find it because she printed it on the funeral program. And so No, but one of these days we'll find it.
So essentially, that was your first published work.
Essentially, that was my first published work, and it was and my first public work. Right? People got to see that, my family, and got to see that and got to engage with it, and then let me know how they felt. Right? Oh man, this really made me feel better. Oh man, those words you said or that you wrote really made me feel something. And then you know, as a young person, like, oh wait, you mean to tell me that I have power? That's it. That's all I needed, right? I have power because I have language, and language has power. And now that I know that, I can wield this sword and shield in a very different way.
I'm curious, why do you write?
For a lot of reasons, I think I write to try to understand myself. I think that's why I started. Just trying to figure out, where do you put it? I think you go through life. The biggest misconception is that we walk through life in sort of slickers. And what I mean by that is as if nothing kind of sticks to us. And the truth is everything does. Everybody sticks. Every experience sticks. It all sticks. It may not be top of mind, right? But it all lives in your subconscious. Every person you meet, every conversation you have, right? Every story you hear, every time someone tells you a secret or confides in you, right? It's all in your body, And I was trying to figure out as a young person where to put it. I got to get it out of my body, right? I don't have the capacity to hold it all. And I'm an anxious child at that point, right? And I don't have the capacity to carry all of this. I don't have, right? My body is filling up, right? My mind is filling up. I don't know if I'm going to be able to manage. And so it came at the right time, and it gave me an opportunity to sort of excavate and exercise some of my thoughts and feelings, which we all need, right? That's the first reason, and I still do it for that reason. The second reason, though, is because I think I also realized that I am of service. My mother taught us that as kids, that like everybody's purpose in life is the same, and that is to be of service to your fellow man. The tricky part is everybody's vehicle is different. And I found my vehicle. And because I found my vehicle of service, then I do my job because it is what I am meant to do, right? My job is to make somebody else's life a little better. My job is to leave the world a little better than it was when I got here. And the way that I choose to do that, or the way that it's sort of come onto me, is through storytelling, through language, through whatever sort of, iteration of wordplay. I know what it's for. It's not for, I take it very seriously. I think there's too much power to play around with it. At the same time, I think that in the playing of it all, you discover new things and new powers, right? But it's too important to take lightly. It's too powerful to take lightly. I think people are a little cavalier about language. And the truth of the matter is, as far as I'm concerned, it's almost like casting spells, right? And not in a sort of woo-woo sense, right? But just in the sense that, like, whatever you say and whatever you write could very well, teachers know this better than anybody, could very well turn a child into a giant or turn that child into an ant, right? All based on what you say, right? What you say, the words that you formulated. And so I know that going into it, and so I think about all those things. And now I think it's my lot. My lot in life is to be of service. This just happens to be the vehicle. And when I feel like my time is up, the writing will continue. The profession may change, but the writing will always be the way that I just try to learn myself, try to understand the world around me. It's a lifesaver. It saved my life in a real way.
Your classification of the types of books that you write fall under young adult fiction. Do you think, when your mother and father propped you up at the big boy table, to hear those conversations, do you think that helps you speak in a sympathetic voice that kids are able to hear? How are you able to connect with your young readers?
I think what it has to do with is my mother and father acknowledging the fact that I was a person, even as a child. And they modeled that. I bring home a C. My father takes me at the table. Listen, kid, did you try your best? Tell me the truth, right? I just want you to tell me the truth, right? Don't lie to yourself. So tell me the truth. Did you try your best? Sometimes I'd say yes. Sometimes I'd say no, depending upon the truth, right? And if I would say no, he would say, well, since you didn't try your best, there has to be some sort of discipline. We have to have some sort of punishment here, and you have to hold you accountable, right? And so we need to figure out what ways are we going to make sure that like you understand that the C doesn't bother me. You letting yourself down You not pushing yourself to do your very best is something that is unacceptable, because life is coming, right? And you can't let you down. You don't have to get an A, but you always have to put your best foot forward, right? And in the moments where I said I did do my best, he would say, let's work a little harder next time. Good job. We'll just work a little harder next time. That's it, right? That's a very different way to sort of like, instead of being like an A is the only way, it was sort of like, let me talk to my kid and figure out where he is, right? My mother too, right? How you feeling? I'm mad about this. I'm upset about this. You said this to me. You hurt my feelings, and I just don't think I deserved it. My mother was never the type to be like, I say what I want to you because you're my child, right? My mom was like, oh, if I hurt your feelings, I apologize. I meant what I said, though. I meant what I said. And, you know, when you're wrong. But at the same time, she could own that, like, perhaps she went too far. So when I sit under the page, I'm looking at these young people as people, right? When I go and see them at the schools and the libraries and in the community centers and all the other places, the one thing they say to me most often is, man, thanks for just talking to us like people, right? Kid to them is pejorative, right? Because to them, they're saying like, man, you know, they always remind us that our brains aren't developed. Imagine what it feels like to be a kid and people would look at you and say like, you don't know how you feel because your brain ain't developed. Meanwhile, the child is like, but I do know how I feel. And I'm telling you, I'm even vocalizing to you how I feel. And what you keep saying is, no, you're not sad, you're just hungry. Right. There's nothing more frustrating than being dismissed that way. And adults know that more than anybody. And yet we do it to these young folks, right? And my job is to say, like, I'm never gonna do that. I can't. If you feel it, I know you feel it, and I'm gonna write it in the book, right? I'm not gonna dismiss your feelings or your experiences. I'm not gonna dismiss even some of the confusion that does exist in your brain. All of that's still very real, right? That exists in your body, and it could cause some anxiety. It can cause mistake making. It can cause all sorts of things. So let me honor that by putting it on the page in a way that my parents honored it by allowing me to sit at the table and have some discourse without just assuming they knew everything about me, right? They asked me, tell me what's going on, and then we'll adjust accordingly. That's all. I think it comes from them.
I'm really interested in your process. Do you start by putting pen to paper? Do you start on the computer with a blank screen? You know, how do you approach a new work?
It's pen to paper. It's pen to paper. But more importantly, I approach it with a person. You know, most of my books, they're not very plot heavy. And the reason for that is because I truly, truly believe that people invest in people. I don't think we invest in plot lines or product or even profit. I think we invest in people, right? I always tell young people this. I say, look, if you think about your best friend, your very best friend, you could sit with that person for 8 hours, 9 hours, and do nothing and have a wonderful time because you invested in that person. You believe that that person's presence is enough, right, to bring enjoyment to your life. We all do this. We do this with their partners. We do this with our parent, right? It's like just sitting down and kicking it. We ain't got to do a whole lot. There doesn't need to be an explosion or a roller coaster. Or, I just want to be around you. So my job is to create characters that people want to just be around for 200 pages. And if I can do that, then I'm already halfway there. The rest of it is just complicating the life, right? But first, it's people first.
And are you listening to music? Do you go away? Do you write in the same place every time?
Man, definitely no music unless it's instrumental. I be singing and rapping, man. It'll all just be woven into the story. So I can't do the music thing. I can do voices though. So I do a lot of podcasts when I'm working because I think that the white noise of other people can help me quiet the white noise in me. I can hear my voice clear with other voices. That's why we all work in coffee shops, right? It's like it's a weird sort of there's a deafening of all of the voices that I need to quiet down so I can hear the important one, as long as there are other voices sort of, right? It's an interesting sort of thing. And I can work anywhere. I'm not like one of these, I'm not that ritualistic or that, like I'm ritualistic in that I work every day and I work for a huge chunk of the day, every single day. But it could be on an airplane, it could be in a hotel room, it could be in the lobby, it could be in my house, it could be in a coffee shop, it could be in my office, right? Like I'm cool, man. As long as I got my tools, I can get it done wherever.
You don't stray away from the complicated or the uncomfortable conversations. Are you ever afraid of what is going to come out of your mind onto the page when you start a work?
I'm always afraid. Listen, if I'm not afraid, I won't write it. Everything I've ever made has scared me. Everything I've ever made has challenged me, challenged my insecurities, made me wonder about the things that are living inside me. But that's okay. At the end of the day, I'm still an artist. right? Like I still make art, right? So even though it has all these other functions and I'm thinking about all these other things, I'm still an artist who wants to make art. I want to be creative. I want to push myself to get better. I want to push myself to see just how far narrative can go. Like what worlds can we really create, right? Like, or how can we show this world in a way that feels more magical? And at the same time, I'm never really worried about the tricky stuff so much, right? Like the complicated conversations don't necessarily bother me because I've been around kids long enough to know they can handle them. It's just about how I'm articulating them that can be a little scary, right? How are you going to do this in a way that feels, that holds up the artistic integrity, but also can connect to your population, like to your audience, you know? That can get a look, and also pulling them along with you, like meeting them where they are, but also pulling them along. Because as I say, we are the tastemakers, we are the people who are building the palette, right? So in order to do so, the work has to be sophisticated and layered and complex, not just the issue, the work itself, right? The literature has to be sophisticated and complex and layered. And you know, I'm always like, did I go too far? Is this a little much? But it is what it is at the end of the day. And the kids always meet me where I am too.
You know, there's the they that have said that you've gone too far. You know, why do you think books are banned? Is it fear?
I think, you know, I think books are banned, and I think the fear of books is that books can be ruminated upon. Books can be studied. I think the fear, and the reason I say that, the reason why that's an X factor is because kids play violent video games. They have YouTube. They have books are, if anything, this is the least of their worries. It should be, right? Your kid is simulating war every night with his friends. No one seems to care, right? Your kids are doing all kinds of things every day, and you have no idea about it. Your kids are on Twitter looking at porn, and you have no clue. Right? And yet you're concerned about the fact that I've written in a book, you know, something that actually humanizes all the things that they're seeing in clips. Something that actually fleshes out and makes real all the things that they're seeing in clips, right? All the things that are being perverted in clips. And so for me, I think that the fear is that with a book you can revisit and you can start to formulate constitutions. And I think that people are afraid of their kids. My mother was never afraid of me coming home and say I disagree. But I think most parents are, and I think that most parents are afraid for their children to disagree with them because they're not always sure that they're going to have the response when their children ask the difficult questions. And instead of just humbling yourself and saying, I don't know, let's figure this out together, right? Like instead of knocking yourself down a peg, I think it's easier to just to eradicate the option. You know, and that's unfortunate. You know, like I always say, people who steal from people steal because they do not have. So if you take the opportunity for intellectual edification, for mental freedom, it's because it was not afforded to you. Right? I really believe that. You know, I also will say that I think that it is a shame and that we have entered into a really strange space if what we are now using as the bargaining chip to have our complicated conversations up here around politics in this country are our children, the one thing that we have been able to agree upon. I think we're in a tough place. Everybody wants the best for the babies. They are the ones who are most vulnerable and yet the ones who are the most human amongst the humans. Everybody wants their children to be safe, to get education, right? To grow into whole people, everybody, right? And so to use them as the new bargaining chip, to use them as the new leveraging point, I think is despicable on so many levels.
You wrote a book, All-American Boy, with Brandon Kiley, that was banned.
Yeah.
You know, why was it banned? What was that collaboration like?
The collaboration was amazing. He's one of my best friends, you know.
And just give me the one-liner on the book. What's the book about?
The one-liner is Rashad and Quinn, a black boy and a white boy, growing up in the very same neighborhood. They go to the same school and they even have the same set of friends, but they do not know each other. And on a Friday night, Rashad is accused of stealing in a grocery store and is abused by a police officer. And Quinn witnesses it and knows the cop as his father figure. And then he sets off on these 2 weeks where the two of them are trying to reckon with this experience, right? That book was banned because nobody wants to ever talk about police officers in any way that isn't sort of like these are the greatest human beings in the world, as if they're not human beings. And furthermore, nobody wants to complicate the argument, right? It's not. We're not even saying like this book is about how this cop was a good man to this boy and did a bad thing. So then the question becomes, who is he in this space, and how do we grapple, right? And Rashad has a police officer, a former cop father, who has also done a bad thing. It is not to say that we are, I think people, listen, we have a hard time. I think we live in a country that is, unfortunately, has become anti-intellectual, perhaps because we're not reading anymore. And I think that the easiest thing to do for all of us is to simplify our arguments. When what's necessary is for us to constantly be complicating our arguments, right? And this book works to help complicate the argument while also bringing light to the fact that like police abuse is a real thing, always has been a real thing, by the way. It's not a new phenomenon, always has been a real thing, and it's affecting a lot of people every day in this country. That's it. I mean, like, that's it, right? I think for parents in a lot of places, like, we don't want our kids to see officer friendly as anything other than officer friendly. And it's like, well, I think the real question is, do your children know that officer friendly is a human being? And if he is a human being, that means that he comes with all the things that human beings come with. The only difference is he's been given an outsized amount of authority. So he has all the same mess that we have and a gun and a badge. That's it. Which complicates all of our relationships around it, right? And we should probably be okay or get okay with engaging and having discourse around what that actually means and what that looks like down the line. That's it, man. But,
And for an artist who's poured his work into a book, how does it feel for someone to not discredit it, but in a sense, yeah, by banning it in certain industries?
It feels disrespectful to the kids, right? It hurts my feelings, but it's disrespect to the children. It hurts my feelings because it makes me feel like people think that I'm out here trying to harm children. But I think it's disrespectful because what it says is that adults actually don't respect the intellectual capacity of young people, as if they don't already know, as if they're not already having these conversations. They have the internet, right? They have that's the part that I'm most confused about. I'm like, you do know that they are already wrestling with this. It's like saying like, don't write a book about gun violence, don't write a book about school shooters. You do know they do school shooter drills. So I don't know why this would be a complicated conversation. Like, don't write a book about sex. You do know there are people being pregnant in their schools now. You do know they're having sex, right? Anyone who believes that the teenagers are not having sex, it's like, I don't know. This is a human experience. This is a human experience. I'm just trying to create a place for them to land so that they understand what it is that's happening to them, what's happening around them. That is our actual jobs, right? My job isn't to be the captain of the ship. My job is to be the lighthouse. Right? I'm not trying to man nobody's boat. That's for them. It's their lives. My job is to point in the direction that is safe. That way is the journey, right? We're going this way, but not to teach you, not to tell you how to row. That's on you. You in that water, and that water gets deep. I'm just telling you which way safety is. That's all, right? If you start to veer off, follow the lighthouse. That's all I'm saying. But I'm not, right? To me, that's what our job is, to teach them which way to go, but not to teach them how to go there. Everybody's afraid of it, and I get all kind of nasty comments, and it is what it is, man. I'll tell you what I'm most exhausted about. I have to talk about this all the time. And what I would rather put my energy in is talking about all these librarians and teachers who are fighting on the other side, who are putting their lives at risk, their jobs at risk every day to make sure that books like mine stay in the bookstore, stay in the library, and stay in the schools. They really are the ones who deserve to be sitting in front of this camera and telling you what's really going on, man. I'm going back to my ivory tower so I can be an artist. But there are real lives, real human beings who are not famous, who are fighting on behalf of our children every day.
Why is literacy important?
Literacy is important because it's the mere act of reading, the mere act of it teaches discipline, persistence, consistency, broadens the vocabulary. The more words you have, the less violent you need to be. It teaches you how to listen to yourself, and it keeps your imagination stoked, which is to say that literacy is important because it is the very thing that keeps us free.
When you look at the global landscape of especially the genre of writing that you do, like, are you encouraged by what's happening outside of the United States, and would you like to see some more of that come into the landscape here? Are people braver? Is there more?
I mean, yeah, it's hard to say. What I will say though is that there's a lot of beautiful stories being told around the world, and that America is the only place that doesn't read them. Right? We don't do much translated work here, and we should. Right? We need to build that part of ourselves up. We're limiting ourselves from knowing more about the world because we don't read the world's stories. Well, they read ours though, by the way. Yeah.
You've said this before, that your look is intentional, the way you present yourself. You know, do you also feel the same way about what you write and the spaces? Like, you know, when you walk into a space, you command a certain, people are going to gravitate towards you. You're like your dad. That's the dude I want to know. Do you want your books, and do you feel like your books are doing the same thing in the spaces that they enter?
Always. I think from the very beginning of my career, I wanted my books to serve as objects that kids were interested in, right? So the story comes second. I wanted to make sure that when a kid sees somebody else with that book, they're like, yo, what's that? Right, what's that? Or they see my name and they're like, yo, what's that? You know? And then they get into the story. I think just thinking about that has been a huge shift in the way that I make stuff and make books and present, for that matter. Book covers, everything is a part of it.
You have accolades, and I'm not even going to start to name, but one of them, which you just vacated your position not too long ago, is the Ambassador of Literature. Of all of the accolades that you've been able to receive, what does it all mean to you?
Not much.
Nothing, none of them. Why?
I won't say nothing, because I think that's a little dismissive of all the wonderful committees who have done the work of choosing. But the medals and the plaques, they're all underneath my couches, man, in boxes.
And because it's a conversation, I'm talking about like New York Times bestseller,
Sure.
Carnegie Medal winner, Newbery Book Honor, Prince winner, Coretta Scott King awards.
Yeah. I mean, you know what it is. Listen, don't get me wrong. It feels amazing to have been acknowledged, right? Many, many times over at this point. I'm so grateful. But I can't continue to do my work if I sit in amongst the shrine of myself. And so every day is a day I get up and pretend that none of that ever happened. The same kind of hunger, the same thirst. What's that famous boxer who said, it's really difficult to get out of bed and run 50 miles when you're climbing out of silk sheets, right? I need to stay hungry because our children are. I need to stay thirsty because our children are. And so it's been a blessing, man, to be able to have seen the things that I've seen and be honored the way that I've been honored, but there's work to do. And until the work is done, when it's all over, when I decide to put the pen down or move on, then I'll pull them all out and really have a good cry. But until then, forward.
What haven't you said yet? What's sitting deep in your soul that you're like, I got to get this out?
All right, so I'm not supposed to talk about this, but I do want to document it because it is coming. I've always wanted to write about the interior lives of Black boys and boys in general, specifically in this particular context, heterosexual boys, the interior life of them just before they lose their virginity. I think that unfortunately we are turned into phalluses far too early, animals far too early. We are expected to know how to do everything. And the truth is, we don't even talk about it. I don't know, have you ever thought about this? Has anyone ever asked you? It's interesting, because the truth is, if we were all being honest, we are anxious and nervous. We have body image issues. We are confused. We're excited. We don't know what to expect. All these things are happening inside of our bodies before this huge transformative moment. And we never discuss it. Most of us have already lied 1,000,000 times before we get there, right? Like, we don't know. I mean, and so I wanted to write a story to help parents have this conversation, but also for young boys to know it's okay, bro. Most of us unfortunately have had older women be inappropriate. All of this is real, right? And so I'm like, I wanted to write a book and have written a book that says it's okay. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be nervous. It's okay to be anxious. That all of us are going through it in this moment. Just none of your friends are willing to say this to you. And so I'm getting ready to let all of you off the hook It's called 24 Seconds From Now, and so we'll see. You know, I mean, you want to see some banning, it's coming. But the book is necessary. So,
Why is storytelling important?
storytelling is important because, as far as I'm concerned, this is the most valuable of the human technologies. This is the most human thing we have to offer one another to be better. Human beings are most influential to other human beings. Nothing influences us more than each other. And so the more we share our stories, the more whole we will be collectively. And we'll realize that we're not actually that different.